Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, I'm going to be talking about the PlayStation 4, since it's all the rage right now, don't you know, and the Xbox 720, and comparing them to modern gaming PCs now and in the future, or at least for the foreseeable future. Now, obviously, with a subject like this, it's almost impossible not to get into too many kind of flame bait wars, and I'm really hoping it's not going to turn into that. I merely mean this as education. As anyone knows who regularly watches the channel, I actually don't really give a crap about sides, AMD, Nvidia, PS4, Xbox. I love all the consoles. I like my gaming. However, this is just to simply talk about the point. So now I've kind of covered my ass for anyone who's not a regular viewer, let's jump in. So first thing we have to talk about is, of course, to understand the very basic understanding of PC versus console, and that is that one is an open source platform and one is not, and that doesn't necessarily mean that either has a benefit. Allow me to illustrate this just for one moment. Now, obviously the PlayStation 4 and actually the Xbox are using AMD technology for both the graphics card and the CPU. So let's for a moment hypothesize that you and your friend both have AMD machines. Just for example, and by AMD I mean both the graphics card and the processor are indeed AMD, okay? Now let's assume, just for 1 second, that a developer, let's for example say Crytek, so we'll say Crysis 4 is in development, and let's just assume that they say we're not going to develop or support Intel or Nvidia based systems. Obviously this will never happen in a million years, but let's just for a moment hypothesize it just for my point. So let's assume this is the case. Well, even if you were to assume this, the problem then becomes that there are so many AMD-based graphics cards and, well, processors that it's very difficult still for them to optimize it. And even if you were both to have the same processor, the same graphics card, there are still dozens of different variables. For example, different hard drive, different monitor resolutions that you're going to be playing at, different amounts of system memory, different operating systems, different driver revisions as well. That's a big one. My point being, it's very difficult. So for example, let's say you and your buddy Tom both build a system. The chances are, even if the system, if you were to benchmark the hell out of the two systems and you were roughly to perform evenly, let's say you have an AMD card, he has a Nvidia card, and you both have respectively different CPUs, or even the same CPU but just, you know, slightly different revisions. An example of that would be Intel's Sandy Bridge versus Ivy Bridge. They're pretty much neck and neck, especially if you start overclocking both CPUs. The point being that they're very different and they have different instruction sets. Many times they have slightly different, completely different driver sets, and all of this together means that it's a lot harder to fully optimize a PC game than what it is a console game. Okay, now we've got that understood, at least arbitrarily, we're going to jump instead onto consoles. So consoles have do not have an open source platform, by which I mean it's closed. I'm pretty sure many of you will know this, but I just want to get this point out of the way. So let's assume we're talking about the Xbox 360 for a moment. In other words, a console we know and love, and you know, it's been around the block for a while now. Generally speaking, there's not that much difference between your Xbox 360 and my Xbox 360. Sure, yours may have... I've got one of the original launch consoles, okay? So let's assume you have a no shiny slim one, okay? And you have the 250GB hard drive model. It could be bigger, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is your Halo is going to look pretty much the same as my Halo. There's not going to be a difference. In other words, the specifications do not change. Internally, the machine still has 512MB of unified memory. The processor is the same, the graphics card's the same. It's not like they're going to suddenly increase the amount of shaders the graphics card has or bump up the clock speed of the processor. It's still going to be the same specs. Now, the problem with this is quite simple. You can only tweak a platform a certain amount before you start running out of power. In other words, you want the game to look better, but by golly, it just can't do it. In other words, this hardware physically is incapable of being pushed any further regardless of the programming tricks. An example of this would be the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 had some very poor design choices. I think Sony have even kind of admitted it with the PlayStation 4. But what they have done, I'm talking about developers, especially first-party developers, which would be, for example, Uncharted is a prime example of this, as well as somewhat Infamous and a few other games. They're very impressive looking, and one of this is they've simply gotten around the flaws in the system design, but they can only do that for a certain amount of time. In other words, there comes a time where the processor just says, you know what, I've given you all I can. You can be as smart as you want to program for that processor, but you simply cannot press any further. And this, my friends, is the defining factor between PCs and consoles, regardless of the price and everything else. So, in terms of actual raw performance power, regardless of whether the console or the PC are released right now, let's say, for example, you were to have a PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 was to perform better or look better, eventually there will come a time when the PC technology simply moves ahead. So does that mean that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720 are never going to shine? Does that mean that they're inferior and that's the end of it? No, of course not. That's not really the purpose of the systems. The purpose of the systems is very simple. It's to provide really great gameplay. And, for example, when the Xbox was first released, for the most part, there wasn't that much difference between PC and, the Xbox derivative. Sure, there was a bit. I'm not saying they were exactly the same. But, for the most part, the Xbox was nowhere near as behind as it was now. Fortunately, there is a very good thing for both PC and, well, PlayStation, and that is they're becoming very similar. Back in the day of, say, the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, there was a lot of difference between the two architectures. Sure, there was some similarities, of course. No machine's going to run without, say, system RAM. But generally speaking, the architecture of the processor, the architecture of the graphics, they were all very different. Now, for example, the Xbox and, of course, the PS4 are both using AMD graphics cards and processors. They're both using DDR RAM, and it's all basically parts that you could buy off the shelf. Sure, they're modified to use lower power profiles to put out less heat and so forth, but all of this means that you're going to get far better ports between the two systems, especially on the PC, which of course has been a very, very sore sticking point recently. Many PC gamers are getting very pissed off, I'm sorry for the language, but they just don't like the fact that some PC games have been very lackluster ports. Now I'm going to not get into a like-for-like comparison exactly right now. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, the console hasn't been released, and so, well, there is a slight possibility that things could be subject to change. Number two, if I was to give a like-for-like comparison, PC parts would have moved on by now. By then, should I say. However, there are going to be a few people who are saying, what about things such as the memory on the system? Some people are crying foul already, and I've read this on, forums, I've read this on people's Facebook statuses and so forth, and, it's just being bandied about. The PlayStation 4 doesn't have enough memory. The PlayStation 4, Sony made a mistake. They haven't gone with X, or they haven't gone with Y. There are some things you have to understand. Firstly, I'm actually very impressed with the amount of system memory. Indeed, Mockup, and I'll tell you guys a little secret here, Mockup a couple of years ago, maybe about a year ago actually, I was, for fun, mocking up a system, and I was mocking up a console, and I wasn't technically, designing the whole thing as in, the controllers right down to the, the capacitors on the board, but what I was doing is I was saying, hey, if I was designing a console right now, what type of hardware would I go with? And I was assuming the console was going to be released either this year or 2014. I was going basically roughly around those specifications, and as it turns out, I chose 4 gigs of RAM for the system, but I said to myself I'd much prefer to have 8. 8 gigabytes is 16 times the amount that we currently have, which is a gargantuan. Now, remember what I was saying to you earlier about closed source. In other words, the platform itself is closed. This means that you don't need as much memory. One of the reasons is quite simple. Windows isn't there. Therefore, the operating system has a much, much smaller memory footprint. Another point being, of course, the drivers. They're smaller. Everything is just smaller, everything's more compact, and therefore much easier to fit into the memory. The PlayStation 4 also, of course, it does have a GDDR5 RAM, which has screamingly higher bandwidth. There are a couple of benefits to this. Firstly, it's unified. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm pretty sure most of you probably will be by now if you've been regular viewers of my video, but unified memory simply means it's shared between the buses of both the CPU and the GPU. I'm slightly oversimplifying that, but I'm just trying to do it for clarity's and the quickness sake more than anything. This isn't really the case with PCs. With PC, if you were to take a look at any modern gaming PC, there are two types of memory. I'm not talking about the cache, for example, on your graphics card, on your CPU. That would be a bit silly, but I'm talking about mainly. There is, of course, the main system memory, which is usually what most people talk about when they're talking about RAM, and finally video card memory. Now currently, if we are looking at, I'm going to just use AMD's range, simply because, well, both systems are going to be using AMD, so it just makes sense for the PC to also, in this particular example, to also be using AMD. If you were to look at, say, the Asus HD 7950 graphics card, that's got 3072 megabytes, also known as 3 gigabytes to you and I, and indeed is running at 900 megahertz, and already is a better graphics card basically than the PS4. I'm not going to give an exact comparison. If you guys really want to do that, you could just Google the graphics cards. I don't really think you need me to read out everything and say this is faster and this is better, or the PS4 does this better. It just doesn't really make sense. You've got to bear in mind that Sony didn't go with the very best technology. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is price, two is power. Quite simply, as I've said a dozen times before, there are 2 or 3 enemies really when you're designing something in such a small environment. Indeed, designing a game in laptop in some ways has many of the same inherent issues as designing a console. One of those issues is simple: power. In other words, the more power a device uses, the more heat it also begins to use, and most people don't like heat, and most people don't like too much power draw. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is wear and tear, and 2 is likelihood of things breaking. Remember, the Xbox 360 fell over because of too much heat, effectively. This is the RROD, where quite simply the solid started to become loose on the board, and the board began to bend. I'm just using one example here. In other words, heat and power, too much power, are an enemy, and you don't really want too much of either. In other words, you want to keep them as low power as possible. The third is quite simply trying to make everything in a cost-efficient way as possible. And there is technically a fourth one. You don't want the whole thing to be so big that you have to take it in a suitcase to get anywhere. Ideally, you want it to be able to fit into a reasonable sized bag, so if you want to take it over to your friend's house for a party or whatever, you can do so. It just makes more sense. So with all of that said, of course the PS4 technically right now has a number of benefits. Right now the PS4 has a 8-core CPU, and while performance-wise it may not be as awesome, it does definitely handle multi-threading, which is going to make things very interesting when they're porting it to a PC. One of the issues that, for example, Grand Theft Auto 4 had back in the day on PC was that it was originally designed for a console that, funnily enough, had more cores than the average PC when it was released. The average PC back then was dual-core, and there was an absolute massive difference. You can go ahead and Google this yourself, by the way, and I encourage you to do so. You can Google the difference between Grand Theft Auto running on the same graphics card and the same amount of memory on a dual-core processor and then a quad-core processor. It's an absolute massive difference, because quite simply the game was originally, the engine was designed for ground up, really, to make use of that. Sorry if I'm a bit incoherent sometimes. I'm very tired. I got very little sleep last night, if I'm honest, which isn't really great for the mental state, unfortunately. So with all of that said, I'm thinking that PCs, of course, are going to have some major changes. Obviously, the new range of Intel Haswell processors are going to be released at some point in the not too distant future. Most people are thinking kind of mid-ish this year, which is obviously before the PS4 is released, even if the Intel processors do slip. We're waiting for the next generation of AMD graphics cards, as well as, of course, NVIDIA graphics cards. Right now, there's been some small revisions, and obviously there's the GeForce Titan, which is going to be released, but technically speaking, it's not exactly completely new. But when we're going to be seeing these new AMD kind of 8 series, who knows? It's, you know, they're putting it back a little bit. To be honest with you, I don't kind of blame them. There are a couple of reasons I don't. For one, PC gaming right now, aside from the odd game, Crysis 3 for example, to put it mildly, they're just not really using the graphics card that heavily. I mean, sure, there are certain games that do max it, as I said, Crysis 3 being one of them, Far Cry, high resolution and so forth. But most games are console ports and haven't really been designed with the idea of really using your graphics card to the point where it just can't really do anymore. Indeed, even if you have an older card, for example the GTX 460, which released goodness knows back when, it's still probably going to be enough to get you by on most games. Sure, you won't be able to game at 1080p with high levels AA and AF and so forth, but you will be relatively okay for now because, well, quite simply, consoles are holding you back a little bit. So while I know this has not exactly been the type of video that you might have expected, I know many of you are probably expecting me to go blow by blow comparison as I have, let's say, the Xbox 720 versus PS4. But I think I'm trying to illustrate a simple point. And that is, there's not going to be a clear-cut winner in this particular battle. What I am, however, trying to also illustrate is the massive differences in design philosophy, between the PS4 and earlier PlayStation consoles. It's certainly coming a lot more together than it used to, and you can even see this in, for example, the rumours of the Steam box from, of course, Valve. Now, if you really want an arbitrary measure of just how powerful a system is, you really have to go with how much actual raw performance, in other words, teraflops of information it can handle. And if you want me to be honest, the PS4 has a very good graphics card. It is indeed using one that's almost 2 teraflops of performance, also known as 1.84, if you want me to be really precise. However, PCs, of course, don't really have that level. The 7950 that I mentioned earlier, for example, has 3.5 teraflops of computing power. But once again, these are only arbitrary numbers. For a long time now, we're going to be seeing developers really pushing the hardware of consoles, and we're going to be seeing a very impressive number. So yes, if you want me to come down on one side and say to you in a very definitive term that PCs are going to be faster than PlayStation 4, that's the answer. It will be. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be better than the PlayStation 4, and that's the key. Indeed, one of the reasons I do play PC are the better graphics. You know, it's nice to have the better graphics, but the primary reason that I play on PC is choice, and that's the real reason I play on PC. It's pure choice. I prefer the community on it in terms of Steam. I like Steam, but the main reason, if I'm honest, is the modability. I like the cheap price of the games. Okay, sure, for the most part, of course, PC gaming hardware is pretty expensive. For example, high-end graphics card. I'm just going to use British pounds here because I'm lazy right now, because I'm tired and not going to Google. But this same graphics card is £276. That's including VAT, by the way. If you want to exclude the VAT, it's about $230. Regardless of the fact, it's pretty darn expensive. However, for people like myself, and obviously I'm running RGT, but even before, even if you discount RGT, one of the things that I do for a living is, well, web and video editing. So yeah, because of that, I naturally have a high-end processor. I naturally have a lot of memory on my system. Therefore, it's not that prohibitive for me in terms of cost to just stick in a better graphics card. It works well with Adobe Premiere or whatever other applications anyway. Thanks for CUDA, but that's just a completely different story. I'm going a bit off topic here. My point being that you're going to have to play on whichever console you want to play on. While that might sound a cop-out, sure, AMD and Sony have together created a really great system. There's no doubt about it, and when we see games like Resistance, when we see Infamous, there's no doubt about it that the games look fantastic, they're going to sound fantastic, and when they're hooked up to the 40-inch TV in your room, it's going to look amazing, but then so would a PC if you were to do the same thing. I think many people right now are getting really focused on the technical aspects of it, and while I understand that because it's extremely exciting, I think you also have to remember that primarily we want to see the games, and regardless of the fact, I think it's going to be a very exciting time, no matter which way you slice it, if you don't mind me using the proverbial phrase. So yeah, overall, PCs will win in consoles. Even a mid-range PC in 2 or 3 years will probably beat the PS4 in terms of specifications, just as any modern PC right now stomps all over Xbox 360 and has done for a number of years. If you want an example of that, check out Crysis 3 comparison video. And sure, I admit, Crysis 3 could have probably looked better on PC. And once again, this is an example of them having to tone it down simply because of it, simply because of consoles. They couldn't go too high in the polygon models. They couldn't do this. They could have obviously done that. They could have redesigned the game up, but they just didn't do it. And I don't blame them in that respect. My point being that the next generation of systems is going to be massively better. So yeah. Without really wanting to sound like I'm copping out, because I'm not, I will always give you guys my completely honest opinion. Right now, PS4 will lose out to modern gaming systems, but it might not on launch. In other words, for a while, the modern day systems may struggle a little bit because, well, quite simply, you need a faster hardware in a PC than what you do a console because of how optimized console games are, because it's a closed system. What is going to be more interesting to me is the social aspects of the PlayStation, not the raw performance of how the games are going to look. And I will be buying a PlayStation 4. In fact, with some of the stuff I've heard about the PlayStation 4, such as, for example, the ability to jump in and out of games of people, I'm actually going to buy one just so you guys can play with me. It's that simple. I want, people on the channel, hopefully, if the channel's still around and kicking back then, I have, no intention of going anywhere, that I want you guys to jump in and I want you guys to play with me and I want you, to have a good time, and that's one of the reasons I want to own a console. Personally, I don't play FPS on console. That's just because of the pad. I'm bad at pad. I'll just be honest. I'm really shockingly bad at it. Having said that, I haven't played FPS properly in a long time, so I'm pretty shocking on keyboard and mouse, to be honest. But that's beside the point. What I am, however, saying is that that's just my personal preference. I am very interested to see the social aspects of gaming on the PlayStation 4. I don't want Sony to focus on the media and everything else at the detriment to the gaming, which is, of course, as I've said before, one of the things that the Xbox founder, I can't remember his name offhand, it's right on the tip of my tongue, has said that both Microsoft and Sony are guilty of, that they've been so focused on you being able to stream, the latest, I don't know, Battlestar Galactica or whatever show you want to watch on your, on your console, that they're forgetting about the games, and of course they are what's really the reason you're going to buy it. After all, you can use your Skybox or your cable or whatever other reason, Netflix on your PC or on your Android device or what have you, to watch these things. But the real reason you're buying the console is of course to play Crysis, is of course to play next Gears of War or the next God of War or whatever type of war you want. So I really want to see the social elements. I'd love to see Facebook integration, not so much the clips. I'm not against them or anything like that. It's not like I don't want to see that, but I'd like to see a better interaction in terms of hey, Bill wants to to play XXX with you, and don't forget and he's looking for more people to fill up the slots, so come online, and MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, it's all there. I'd love to see that, and I'd also love to see being able to post, say, leaderboard images and trophies. And of course that is somewhat in the piece right now already, but I'd love to be able to say, hey, Bill beat my time on, say, Forza, and now I think to myself, bloody hell, he just put me on blast in front of all my friends. I want to beat this guy now, and you rev up the game, you start driving it. To be fair, it'd be more Gran Turismo for me. I'm not really a Forza person, but that's just by the by. My point being, I'd love to see that. I'd love to think to myself, hey, you know what, this creates a really good atmosphere. And I'd also like to see more interaction with social in terms of gaming as well. I think it would be really cool to have more face cams on there. Obviously, there could be some dodginess with that simply because of, some idiot is invariably going to bring out his penis on Xbox Live. It's just that simple. But I just think it would be some really cool stuff that you could do, and I think Sony and Microsoft really need to focus on that. I think there's going to be some awesome stuff with the social. I think it's going to be some nice Kinect stuff and PlayStation I am not that much of a fan of. I'll be honest, one of the issues I had against the Wii, and I'm probably going to be getting some hate mail in about 5, 4, 3, is I didn't really like the motion controls. I think it worked well for certain games. I'm not going to dispute the fact it did. There were some games it really worked quite well for. Even Super Mario Galaxy I actually didn't mind it on, but generally speaking, I'm not a fan of motion controls. I'm very old school gaming here. So I didn't, I'm not massively into it. Regardless of the fact, I think that both systems are going to have to innovate quite substantially. I'm talking about PC and, of course, console. I think both are going to have to innovate. I think both of them are going to have to carve out a new niche. I honestly think that I don't really want handheld gaming to take over. I know some people are always predicting the doom, Prophet of Doom kind of levels of console gaming and PC gaming. They're going to say cloud gaming is going to be, the big thing, and we're all going to be playing eventually on our smartphones and just hook them up to our TVs and so forth. There's always just rumours going about and this type of speculation. What I'd much rather see is evolution of gaming. I think it's going to be a lot cooler. So anyway, I've completely gone off topic here. So, regardless of the fact, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I know I've not exactly answered any particular question to 100%, but anyway, take care of yourselves and bye for now.